On Writing to a Question by Richard Miller and Anne Jurecic. What's writing for? In school, the most common answer given to that question is to make a point. In school, one practices having a point that can be succinctly stated in a thesis statement. Writing is for making points is itself an example of a succinct thesis statement. We think the requirement to start an essay by committing to a thesis is a good way to kill curiosity. It turns writing into a mindless, fill-in-the-blank exercise. Thesis, check. 3 examples, check. Conclusion that summarizes the previous 3 paragraphs, check. This approach to writing is a machine for arguing the obvious. It does not use writing as a tool for thinking new thoughts or for developing ideas that are new to the writer. For your writing to become a mode of learning for you, you must begin in a state of not knowing, rather than committing yourself to a claim you came up with before you've done any curiosity-driven research. This is probably not a form of writing you've practiced in school. So we're going to introduce you to it by describing how Donovan Hone began his writing project accidentally, nagged by a question that just wouldn't go away. Donovan Hone was a high school English teacher reading a student paper when the question that eventually led him to write Moby Duck found him. The student paper mentioned 28,000 plastic bath toys, yellow ducks, green frogs, blue turtles, and red beavers that began washing ashore in Alaska and Australia in the early 1990s. Curious, Hone began to do some research online. Eventually, his research took him all over the world. He learned about ocean currents, cargo ships, consumer demand for inexpensive goods, and the toxins in the Chinese factories where the ducks were made. He discovered that the toys that had been washing ashore fell from a container ship during a storm in the Pacific, after which many of them degraded and disappeared into the toxic stew of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Hone's curiosity took him all the way from news about a flotilla of plastic ducks washing ashore in odd places to questions about the most pressing environmental concerns the world faces today. Notice that Hone didn't begin with a thesis that he then set out to prove. Rather, he started with a question and then threw himself into research for years before he knew how he would define his project's purpose. He continued working once it became clear that no single clear answer was to be found. He assumed responsibility for making certain that the question did not remain unanswered. He just kept working away in the face of not knowing, comfortable with the practice of writing from question to question. To help you learn from the practices used by expert writers, we've adopted a drafting strategy that rejects the idea of starting with a thesis in order to emphasize questioning as the engine of a curious and creative mind. At first, our students were baffled when we suggested this approach. How, they asked us, can you begin an essay without a thesis? We begin by assigning a reading for our students to consider. We then ask them to explore eye-catching moments in the assigned reading, such as when an author says something surprising or confusing, makes an unexpected connection, presents a provocative example, uses a familiar term in a new or peculiar way, or poses an idea or argument that is difficult to accept. Then we ask them to write, but we advise them not to report what the author said and then agree or disagree with it. Instead, we tell them to focus on moments in which they sense a tension between their own thoughts, knowledge, or expectations and what an author has written. Once they've written about a passage or a series of passages, We ask them to conclude their response papers by reflecting on what they were led to wonder about over the course of their writing. Ideally, their exploration of puzzling passages has led them to a compelling question or questions, which they pose in the final sentences of their responses. These should be questions that they can't presently answer and that require more thought, reading, and research. Questions they are truly curious about and want to answer. You might be wondering, what's the point of writing to a question you can't answer? Isn't exposing your own ignorance the exact opposite of what you should be doing in school? These are good questions. We think there are many good reasons to use informal writing to arrive at a compelling question. When you write about confusing or interesting passages from or ideas in a text or set of texts, you are learning to use writing as a tool for thinking. And you'll see that writers often discover what they think in the act of writing. You'll also learn to take more risks with your thinking. Ending with a question you don't know the answer to may feel uncomfortable at first, as if you're revealing a weakness. But openly confronting what you don't know is an essential part of learning to write well. Paradoxically, by writing to a question in a draft, you'll learn how to generate an interesting thesis. Once you've drafted a question that you're genuinely curious about, you're ready for the next step, figuring out how to respond to that question. Your response will be a thesis that's worth writing.